Get started. Okay, I'll keep it.
They didn't do the product. They're like, "Yeah, it's in here." And then they go,
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Jennifer Isherwood. I'm the assistant coordinator of Native American students here at UMM. And I'm also a science educator with Wabanaki compliance. Let's begin with acknowledging that the land we stand upon is Passamaquoddy, land stolen from this First Nation who have lived here for 13,000 years. Land acknowledgements are only the beginning of the work that needs to be done to return the rights and relationship with the land of the Wabanaki people. I first met Nolan on a field trip during a climate change conference with other First Nations to some former dam sites in Maine. We chatted about his time at a well-known university in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They told me about how at this supposed higher education icon of enlightened thinking, he felt unheard and unseen. At another conference together last spring, with organizations focused on and outdoor equity programs for other youth, Nolan stood up and shared how the systems mapping exercise we were being asked to do was for Indigenous people centered on the wrong things. Community supports and counselors are needed, but Nolan said, at the center of helping Native youth and healing Indigenous communities is the relationship with their land. Nolan is a storyteller, an artist, and activist. They are warm and authentic, a true light in the darkness. Let's welcome Nolan.
That was very kind for that introduction. Dengak Sedewen, Nolan Alvater, Sipayik, my name is Nolan Altvater. I'm a Passamaquoddy citizen from Sipayik. I also grew up in Aroostook County, small town of Island Falls as well. And today we'll be talking about a little presentation that I like to call or how our stories are told about us, putting the emphasis on that how. We'll be looking at how in two ways, how in terms of the role of stories and aesthetics within our culture and how they mediate specific relationships between people, land, and creation, and also how in terms of like how these stories are told under a world that is shaped by colonialism and what is a framework we can use with that reality. So we'll be talking about some place-based approaches to cultural preservation in digital environments. I work for the Passamaquoddy tribe at Motahkomikuk with a shared position with Maine Coast Heritage Trust. And a lot of my work entails using digital tools for cultural preservation and assuring that they are governed by the Passamaquoddy community. But before I begin, often in these presentations, there's only one person that's speaking, but by all means, all the work that you're going to be seeing here is very much a collective effort. So I just want to say thank you to everyone, everyone at the Motahkomikuk Museum, Donald Jr., Natalie, Cassie, Dwayne Toma from the Sipayik Museum, the local context team who's been helping us with, we'll be talking about their organization, what they've been helping us with today, Cultural Heritage Imaging, who's also been helping with this work, as well as Maine Coast Heritage Trust, who's a part of the story as well. So just want to recognize everyone who's been a part of this work. It's very much a collective effort. So engaging in this project and thinking of how in those two ways, this has really made me reflect on what makes place and how stories create place, and in doing so, shape our identities and our communities. And this led me to reading a lot of the work by an Afro-Caribbean poet and philosopher of Edward Glissant. who lays out this relationship between place, people, and stories and their roles in constructing history. Or how place and space are fundamentally tied to the material landscape and our daily social processes. So when we think of place, we can look at it as sort of a gathering of experiences, histories, languages, thoughts, and even trajectories of inanimate things. And I would say this is true for all people. We all use stories to create place, and in doing so, create ourselves. And it's a matter of how these relationships are built. For the Wabanaki, this sense of place and our identities is found in our stories, in our languages and art, in our cultures and aesthetic expressions. It's a sense of place that comes with specific responsibilities that are tied to relationality and reciprocity with all of creation. And we remember these responsibilities through oral history, birch bark maps, wampum belts, petroglyphs, and so forth. And these, the Wabanaki identities, our stories and places, is exactly what colonialism sought to erase based on their this belief of a superior Eurocentric story, a master narrative, if you will. And this is where we find ourselves navigating today. It's a challenge to bring back our stories, bring back our culture, and bring back our lands for the resurgence of our own self-determination. But how do we do that in this master narrative, in this world shaped by colonialism? And that's what we'll be talking about today in the context of digital spaces and thinking of digital spaces as an extension of physical realities being shaped by intellectual property, which is just an extension of literal private property, which was used to justify the dispossession of indigenous lands. So how do we navigate working in that realm? So we'll discuss first, what is intellectual property and what's its relationship with indigenous peoples? And with that, what is indigenous data sovereignty? And what are the tools and protocols to support indigenous data sovereignty? And then looking at the work that's being done across Wabanaki with indigenous cultural and intellectual property. So quickly getting through the intellectual property law part of it. Intellectual property is just an umbrella term that links together these different laws, different areas of laws together. It includes copyright, patents, trademarks, confidential information, and geographic indicators. So it's just an umbrella term that's used for these different sections of law. I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with copyright. Copyright protects a range of cultural works, including books or literary works, songs, music, visual materials, so films, or even databases and collections or other compilations. And the requirements for copyright, it must be in a fixed material form, so like in a book or some other formation. Must be created by an author or authors, and it must be an original, not a copy. This is an example of Morgan Talty's Night of the Living Res copyright page. I'm sure most of us are just used to flipping over this page and getting right into the story, but that's sort of what's being communicated, these basic premises with that language. And with copyright comes the author's rights, and these rights include the right to reproduce the copyrighted work, create secondary works based upon the copyrighted works, distribute any copies of the copyrighted work to the public, either by sale or by transfer, perform the work publicly, so put on musicals or plays, and also display the work publicly. So think of displaying works in museums, for an example. So you might already be able to see how much of this logic is tied to the idea of physical material property. And with copyright has periods of protection. So here in the United States, periods of protection is the author's life plus another 75 years. And So an author passed in 2000, their work is protected until 2075. Upon expiration of such period of protection, they enter into what's called public domain. And that's where they are allowed to be used freely with no permissions or compensations for use. And that sort of brings in this idea of Creative Commons. And this was a regime established in 2001 that promotes open access, common spaces and sharing. And this is sort of the quote unquote gold standard that institutions like University of Maine push for, is having the least restricted access for data for students or whoever researchers might be working for it. It's sort of the gold standard practice in intellectual property law. However, it's important to note that Creative Commons is dependent on copyright. So to use a Creative Commons license, you need to be the copyright holder. Yes. So again, as I was talking, you might be able to really see how this idea of intellectual property law is a reflection of physical property law or material property law. So think of how these laws create both digital and physical spaces, and the difficulties this creates for Wabanaki people or other indigenous communities who need to rely on this for securing our communal knowledges. You know, we recognize that we need to protect our cultural heritage and stories. But when we are doing it in a regime that's based on this idea of ownership, access, and control, it makes things really complicated for us because we are such a communal-based community. So like, how can one person or persons own cultural heritage? And that's sort of where we'll be talking about the frameworks in place to work through those issues. So an example of some major issues with this. First and foremost, indigenous peoples, 95% of collections held in cultural institutions aren't owned or controlled by, aren't owned and controlled by non-indigenous people. So a big part of it is just a matter of access, like going through years of what's called the salvage period of researchers coming into our communities and looking at us as not able to quote unquote take care of our own culture. So they would come in, document it, and then leave no benefit of indigenous peoples. However, it's not just about access. There's often derogatory, wrong, misleading, or offensive metadata. So what metadata is really just the information about data or data about data. So we look here at this screenshot. This is a screenshot of a collection in the University of Maine's digital archives of Passamaquoddy portraits. And this whole page just says Passamaquoddy unidentified person. So it shows these people just coming in, not even caring to take people's names and leaving. And they just show up in these collections as unidentified. So it shows that this way of othering, as we're just deemed as objects of study, that we're not even worth to have our names documented. And that's sort of where we are recovering ourselves as indigenous people, is working in these spaces. Thankfully, most of these photos we've worked and had these people identified. However, this still stands, the metadata still stands like this in this specific collection. Other key problems with indigenous peoples with copyright, we touched upon sort of the individualistic logic of it. It doesn't recognize community, family, or tribal ownership. So like when these issues go to court per se, the legislators do not care about what's actually inside these collections or inside the data. They only can view it as a form of property. That is all that they care about and all that they can work with. And that goes to the third point there. Commercialization is a big part of it. It seeks to foster and support commercial use rather than communal use. duration, so it has a time set period for protection, so it can't be protected over a longer duration of what we talked about beforehand. In public domain, once it's there, it can be used by anyone at any time. So say if there's tribal protocols where specific cultural items are only to be viewed by matriarchs in the community, anyone would have access to that. It's in public domain. Listed there are other major key issues that we talked about a little bit as well. So in terms of the actual relationship, not just the issues, but how we relate to intellectual property, it's produced one of the most complicated contemporary legal issues in our times due to it raising questions of historical injustices in which Indigenous peoples have faced as a result of colonialism. So it raises questions of how do we go about any rematriations, and if that is even enough. Because it's not just about getting these items returned, it's about changing the frameworks in which we are able to relate to these items. And it's also, again, it's not just a matter of translating or quote unquote indigenizing these Western legal frameworks, and this is true for both intellectual property and material property. So when we get land returned back to us, that's great, but it's coming back as a form of property. So it's coming back in this regime of ownership. And that's the same thing with data and intellectual property as well. But at the same time, we need to protect these. We need to protect our land, and we need to have land returned to us. So it poses this really difficult question of this struggle of how or can these legal systems that facilitated Indigenous dispossession be restructured to support Indigenous sovereignty and futurities. And again, I would say this is really the root struggle in all areas of our lifeways as Indigenous people. This idea of self-determination and sovereignty, it's always on the politics of recognition and how either the nation states define sovereignty. It's never sovereignty on our own basis. So how do we work in those systems? And Linda Twahe Smith, the Indigenous author of Decolonizing Methodologies, reminds us that to resist is to retrench in the margins, retrieve what we were, and remake ourselves. The past, our stories, local and global. The present, our communities, cultures, languages, and social practices, all may be spaces of marginalization, but they have also become spaces of resistance and hope. So when I propose that struggle of how do we navigate in these systems that have inevitably worked towards our dispossession, how do we still manage to imagine what it's like to be Wabanaki and aim for self-determination? And that has been done throughout all generations. Wabanaki identity really consists of this intellectual tradition that uses tools to remake ourselves in the face of ongoing colonial violence, and with the laws that aim to deny or pre-capture our existence. I think that speaks to how we've been able to survive here since, according to our oral stories, time immemorial, according to your archaeological evidence, at least 14,000 years. So it just speaks to this identity of being able to adapt and navigate and still hold on to who we are through in the face of this violence. And part of that resistance is exactly what produced this concept of Indigenous intellectual and cultural property and data sovereignty for Indigenous peoples, which kind of drew a lot of attention when UNDRIP, or the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, was passed. Article 31 of UNDRIP speaks directly to Indigenous intellectual and cultural property. I won't read it all, but it is basically saying that we as Indigenous people have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop our cultural heritage and have the right to protect our intellectual property over such cultural heritage. So, but what does that mean? What is Indigenous cultural and intellectual property? Again, similar to intellectual property law, it's a discourse or an umbrella term about rights and interests that includes our inherent sovereign rights as Indigenous people, as well as our treaty rights. So it's also interesting to think how tools and technology change. So how are treaty rights translated into these new issues that are produced, such as data sovereignty? So how do those translate with each other? Cultural and intellectual property rights. Ownership over our cultural heritage, and then also our Indigenous research ethics and data ethics. So it's not just about data for governance. It's not just about governance of data, it's also about data of governance. And that's sort of the two key foundations of ICIP and data sovereignty. So data for governance is about gaining access to use data. So what I mentioned of how 95% of collections are owned by non-Indigenous people. Data for governance would be the repatriation and access to that. And then there's governance of data, and that's the right to manage access to such data and to ensure it's used as relevant and responsive. So it's sort of these two things that go hand in hand with nation rebuilding and Indigenous data sovereignty. And when it comes to actual data, it's easy to put it into sort of these three fields. So there's data about our resources and environments, so data about our land, about our water, geology. So a lot of work that environmental departments may be doing, or with us working with past data that has been done in our homelands of environmental data. There's data about us as individuals. So this comes as like census data or administrative data or data that has to do with health. And then there's data about us collectives. And this is more of our cultural heritage, our traditions, our archives and oral histories. And this is sort of the area that we'll be looking at today in Passamaquoddy homelands is the data about us as collectives. So the actual how to go about, like how do you support, how do you practice ICIP and data sovereignty? That's where I sort of formulated this idea of place-based approaches for Indigenous data government. And we're going to be talking about these 4 tools that we can use: care principles, MOOC2, traditional knowledge labels, and terra stories. And I like to think of them as the standards in a basket. And for those who don't know what the standards are in a basket, it's the at that stands straight up like that. So it's sort of the base or framework that you can use, but there's importance of local context. You know, there's no homogeneous Indigenous community. It's not a homogeneous identity. Each tribe has their own specific values, language, culture, stories. And that's where I see the weavers coming in for the basket, and together they give you this repository for this information that's protected by these frameworks, but also that is protected by our own knowledge systems as well. And the first framework that is used today is something called the FAIR and CARE principles. And these were developed by the International Indigenous Data Sovereignty Interest Group. They sort of seek to empower Indigenous people by shifting the focus from regulated consultation to value-based relationships that position Indigenous people, data approaches within Indigenous cultures and knowledge systems to actually benefit Indigenous peoples. So what the FAIR and CARE principles are is they took the FAIR principles, which were developed more for just mainstream approaches to like public domain work where it's findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And then a bunch of indigenous peoples came up and added to that with the care principles to put it more into this idea of collective benefit for indigenous communities. So we look at here, it's kind of a regime to use data with the acronym of CARE, so C for collective benefit. So we're talking about using data for collective benefit of indigenous communities. So it could be for inclusive development, innovation, for equitable outcomes. The A, authority to control. So this goes to that data of governance of data aspect of it. So allowing indigenous people to recognize their ability to govern their own data. And then responsibility. So this is really important when indigenous communities are working with non-native people or non-native organizations where they're approaching this information and this cultural heritage with responsibility for indigenous languages and worth use or for positive relationships. And similarly, the E stands for ethics. So recognizing the historical injustice that indigenous peoples has faced. So how can we work to alleviate that when working with information and cultural heritage? And you use these spaces in, you use these principles in spaces such as Mukurtu. And Mukurtu is a free open source content management system built with indigenous communities to manage and share our digital cultural heritage through our own protocols. The core of Mukurtu is the ability to manually enter protocols into the system. So within Mukurtu, you can have it literally, you can use your tribe's language. You can upload your own language to it, so everything can be in the language. And then you can literally input protocols of how cultural heritage, digital cultural heritage is accessed and shared. And there's also a front-facing and quote-unquote private-facing part of it. So for tribes, and we'll look at the Passamaquoddy's Mukurtu site here in a second. So tribes have the option to share what they want with the public for a public-facing, but then also have a backside of it where people in the community have accounts to log into to look at information as well. So this is just one tool to help indigenous communities retain control over their digital cultural heritage while being able to share it with others as well, because relationality is such a big part of it. And with Mukurtu comes with these things called traditional knowledge labels or TK labels. And these were developed by a local context, the organization Local Context in 2010. And Local Context kind of responded, the Mukurtu community was giving this need for a practical method to deal with this issue of intellectual property issues that arose in relation to Mukurtu. And this led to the development of the TK labels, which are customizable labels attributed to cultural heritage items on Mukurtu that allows communities to express local and specific conditions for sharing and engaging in future research. And they come in two forms. There's the TK labels and then there's the biocultural labels. So the TK labels are attributed to cultural heritage items. So like for an example, at Passamaquoddy, we could put TK labels onto our songs or images of petroglyphs. And then there's also biocultural labels, which those are attributed to more biological and environmental data. So any data that our environmental department may collect. So what they do is sort of set up ethics. They communicate sort of these three areas of usage for both biocultural and cultural heritage items. Provenance speaks to sort of the accounts for the origin and where the data is moved or shared. So think of how data and stories are attributed, and we'll look at an example for the Passamaquoddy here in a second. And then protocols are sort of how stories are used and shared. So think, again, if you have sort of maybe a ceremonial object that's only supposed to be viewed by matriarchs in the community, TK labels would allow you not only to label them with that, but also to customize it in MOOC2 where that information is only available to matriarchs in a community. And then permissions, and this communicates how information may be accessed or what their intended use is supposed to be. So say if you don't want things to be for sale, it would communicate that. And that's sort of where we are moving globally with intellectual property law, is from traditional intellectual property law of copyright, going into Creative Commons, and then moving to this this era of traditional knowledge labels. So from property to establishing Indigenous cultural authority is sort of where the movement globally for Indigenous peoples are going to. And for the Passamaquoddy, we'll pull up the website here. This is the Passamaquoddy's MOOC2 website. If you haven't checked it out, I very much encourage to do so. There's a lot of information on here. So I was saying that this is the home page, and in the corner here, there's a login option. And you can, if you don't have an account, you can request a new account, and an email will be sent to our Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, Donald Soktoma, and he'll accept it and get you in there. Or if you already have an account, you can go ahead and log in. And then you can browse the collections we have, and there's a lot in here. One of the popular ones is looking at the wax cylinder recordings, which we'll do here in a second. And then you can see the three traditional knowledge labels that we created for the Passamaquoddy tribe. We'll go through these real quick. So again, they're completely customizable. So this is all the Passamaquoddy language. So they're reflecting our values as Passamaquoddy people of how these things are treated. So our first one,
Ellie Duzig.
Ellie Duzig, or how is it done? How it is done. This label is used for attribution. So if you see this label on any cultural heritage, it's asking for the correct affiliation or the correct name or the correct family to be used when looking at that item. And the second one,
Agakim Kewe.
Agakim Gewe, which means educational in the Passamaquoddy language. So this has to do sort of with the provenance of how these things are supposed to be shared. So in this case, it's made for educational purposes only and can only be shared as such. And that kind of leads to the third one.
Mayud Minawazil.
Mauyud Minawazil, or this is not to be sold. That one is pretty straightforward. Anything that has that label makes it for the cultural heritage not to be sold, or people to derive any profit from sale or production, especially for non-Passamaquoddy people. So these are the three TK labels that the Passamaquoddy uses. There's discussion of creating more. Specifically, I'm interested in creating an intertribal label with how much shared cultural heritage we have with our relatives across Wabanaki. So it's sort of something that's being considered as we go forward with MOOC2 in the TK labels. But how do they actually, like, what is the actual effectability of TK labels? And to look at that, we can actually look at the origin, the project that started them, and it was the Passamaquoddy wax cylinder recordings. So for those who aren't familiar with the wax cylinder recordings, in 1890, an anthropologist, a Harvard anthropologist by the name of Jesse Walter Fuchs came to Calais, Maine, to undertake the first experiments in ethnographic audio documentation with Thomas Edison's wax cylinders. And he documented the Passamaquoddy tribe, a total of 36 cylinders of partial songs, legends, creation stories, and linguistic terms were provided by Passamaquoddy community members, mostly Peter Selmore and Noel Joseph. And these were eventually, after Fuchs had passed away, and after 75 years that it went into public domain, it was deposited in the Harvard Peabody Museum, who has a very infamous history of keeping ancestral remains of Wabanaki and other indigenous people. But then they donated it to the Library of Congress in the 1970s for a project called the Federal Cylinder Project, or FCP. And that led to the 1980s. The people in the FCP visited approximately 100 tribal communities and returned copies of these recordings. And for the Passamaquoddy tribe, they worked with our linguist at the time, David Francis, and he was able to transcribe 4 of these cylinders. However, a big issue was the actual audio quality of it. It quite literally sounded like taking nails to a chalkboard and trying to interpret it through that. But then in 2014, we began to work with local contexts and the American Folklife Center to listen to these again as they raised enough money and technology had came out to be able to improve and enhance the audio. So we facilitated workshops with elders to help translate it and make sense of the recordings, and work with Dwayne Toma, who's a fluent Passamaquoddy speaker, to also work with not only the translations, but Dwayne today brings these songs into ceremony. So it's not only are these being returned again in digital spaces, they're contributing to the material life of the Passamaquoddy people. And this project sort of is what served as the impetus for developing these TK labels. So you look at, these are screenshots taken from the Library of Congress's website. On their own website, they have information about the traditional knowledge labels, but also list the TK labels that we just looked at for the Passamaquoddy tribe. And when you look at the actual the digital infrastructures, which is basically just a fancy word with how computers communicate with each other, we can see that our languages and values are recognized and applied to these songs. So here we have digital systems not only recognizing but applying our own cultural values and protocols to these items in the online environment. And that is such a paradigm change with how Indigenous cultural heritage is treated in these non-native repositories, such as the Library of Congress. There's a great film about this story on local context websites that I encourage people to watch that talks about this, along other projects that were happening at the time with ICIP. But it's just cool to see sort of the Passamaquoddy communities here really leading the way for developing protocols for ICIP and changing the practices of a colonial archive like the Library of Congress.
Nolan?
Yeah.
I'm looking at the bottom line where the rights are held by Harvard.
Mhm.
Can that change? Like, I presume these actual cylinders are being held there because of a specific room conditions. But say the tribe could create their own museum.
Yeah.
Where would those rights be able to be transferred?
And that's where intellectual property law is really tricky, because it needs that ownership label. Someone needs to own these, unfortunately. And you know, us as Passamaquoddy people, I don't think anyone would say that we own our culture. But with that, whereas these rights are held by the Peabody Museum, they have been changed through the implementing the TK labels, and that's where that change comes from. Whereas like they're held by the Peabody Museum, but in terms of actual how, again, looking at the how they're treated is reflective of our ethics and protocols and language. So it kind of gets to that issue of what I opened up with this reality where we have to work with these colonial policies. So it's a matter of how we can do that, and the TK labels are an example of that. But it's, yeah, thank you for noticing that. It's a great question to ask. So I wanted to spend some time looking at some of the ongoing projects that we're doing here at the Motahkomikuk Museum. That's kind of contributing to developing further frameworks for ICIP in our homelands, specifically around two projects. One is using scientific imaging to document ancestral petroglyph sites, and then another one is creating a living archive of place names that are accessible for community members. So for the petroglyph projects, for those who are a little unaware with the petroglyphs that are in homelands, we're talking about ancestral markings that may be from 2,500 to 3,000 years old, and markings that are very significant to us as Passamaquoddy people. It shows us sort of what I was talking about at the beginning, this tradition of using arts and aesthetics to be able to imagine ourselves in our societies. And it shows that also we've always been information or data collectors. One of the bigger parts of the colonial narratives is depicting us as uncivilized or unable to make history. And if you look at our petroglyphs, if you look like at our wampum belts and our birch bark maps and our oral histories and songs, we've always had this practice of collecting information, making sense of it, and creating knowledge. That's been a practice since time immemorial that we've done. And it speaks today with these present day connections of that intellect. It speaks to our survivance as Passamaquoddy people. So being able to still connect with them and make sense of them today, and recognize that they are markings by our ancestors is very significant. However, there's challenges to this work. One of the biggest ones is access to petroglyph sites. A lot of them are on privately owned islands. So how do you get access to those sites for documentation? If you look at the literature that surrounds the petroglyphs in our homelands, there's a lot of inaccurate and offensive studies done. One that really comes to my mind is one of the authors claims that these markings were done by the quote unquote red paint people. And if people aren't familiar with that false narrative, it's premised on this belief that there were a society of indigenous people, the red paint people, who were here and that had no relation to present day Wabanaki people. And that's been used as a strategy to actually work through NAGPRA laws. So the laws where ancestral remains are supposed to be returned to us. There's a lot of studies saying that, well, no, these aren't your relatives, so therefore you don't have any governance on them. So that's some of the narratives even surrounding these petroglyphs as well. And degradation. Rising sea levels and climate change are really eroding these at a much rapid pace than quote unquote natural. And trespassing as well. We've unfortunately had people come onto the sites and take heavy duty chalk to them and draw over them. So those are sort of the main challenges that we're working through in this project. And a part of all of these projects across Indigenous territories, it's about working together. And the story of the petroglyphs here, back in 2006, we worked with Maine Coast Heritage Trust to have petroglyph sites returned. And started in 2022, we worked with a scientific imaging training organization, Cultural Heritage Imaging from San Francisco. And right now, 2023 and beyond, we're in the process of generating high definition 2D and 3D images of petroglyphs. And we're sort of in the process right now, determining on where to archive these. We really want to protect the location of these petroglyphs due to the fact that they're being degraded. So how do we share this information without really sacrificing their location, which may entice people to go out and try to see them? Is sort of what we're figuring out. But I can show you. The work that we've been doing with this. So this is one of the ledges of petroglyphs that we have. And this is the training that we did with Cultural Heritage Imaging. So it's just taking a series of images and creating 3D models of petroglyphs. And this is going to come in handy, not just for preservation, but also being able to say if there's an elder who, this is on a very sort of ragged beach, an elder who can't access these sites, it gives us ways to have them being able to access it digitally. And it's also a way for preservation. And as you can see, this was data that was collected after someone took chalk to them. So you can really see, yeah, you're able to quote unquote see them better, but it just, it really deforms and degrades the actual markings that our ancestors left. So this is, and we have someone's initials putting it down here as well. Let's see here. But we also have the actual stories that our ancestors left. So here you can see one that we call the birthing woman. So right now, we're going from ledge to ledge and site to site to create these 3D models with the hope of putting them all together in the software and kind of creating a map with that. And that is where, with that, that's where we're kind of debating or struggling of making a map because and giving up such a precise location for people, because then obviously their locations would be made public. So yeah, trying to figure that out right now. And with mapping, a big part of it is the tool that you use for mapping. And that's where this another project of place names comes in. This project was a part of an oral history project started in the early 2000s by Donald Soktoma, who worked with linguists in the community, interviewing them to document over 400 place names, and created this interactive CD in the background there. However, this CD it's not a living archive, and I mean, computers rarely even have CD jacks on them, and it's a CD that actually only works on specific computers. So there was this need to create a living digital archive that not only preserved this information, but protected it as well and make it more accessible to community members. And meanwhile, to do that, sort of resisting colonial spatial domination, that speaks to the significance of place names and how much colonization depended on renaming what's now Maine. So this project sort of speaks to resisting that as well. And that comes to this tool, Terra Stories, that I came across this year. Terra Stories is a geo-storytelling application built to enable Indigenous and other local communities to locate and map their own oral storytelling traditions about places of significant meaning or value to them. And it was designed in tandem as MOOCR2 is being designed to help support Indigenous data sovereignty and ICIP. And right now, I'm working with the developers of Terra Stories in local contexts to work together to kind of create more frameworks for geospatial data rather than cultural heritage data, and kind of trying to find ways to cross-platform, because right now in MOOCR2, you can't really work with geospatial data or dynamic maps. However, in Terra Stories, you can, and we'll look at Terra Stories a little bit. But overall, it's a living archive that can be added onto over generations. So Passamaquoddy people will be coming in these positions after us. So how can we create a space for them to continue this work over generations for resurgence of this knowledge? And I'll sort of walk through Terra Stories as I explain it. There we go. I'm already logged in, but let me log out real quick. So this is the login page to a Terra Stories server that I created for the Passamaquoddy tribe. So the great thing about Terra Stories is it's an internal server, so it's not something that you rely on someone creating for you. So it involves a little bit of server building, but with that, you get to set access, who has access to it, and then similar with MOOCR2, how that access is determined in terms of cultural protocols. So for this, I created just a generic username and password for sort of these presentations, Passamaquoddy people, and that allows you to log in. And you can enter the site, and this is the home page. And for this presentation, I kind of just used it as a sandbox or some experimentation. So I added some place names around Sipayik, which is one of the Passamaquoddy reservations, also known as Pleasant Point. So this allows to use cartography or map making and to put it into this digital space, but have it only accessed by those through permission. So you go to the member dashboard, you create users for people in the community or for whoever you want access to it. But you can also, there's a function where you can also share it with non-users as a link for them to see the information. And you can also pick which information you want them to see. So you might not want to see them all. You might not want them to see all the place names or all this information, just some of it. And with Terra Stories, there's three, this is the content management system side of it, and there's three sort of themes that you can add on here of stories, speakers, and places. And in order to create a story, you need to have at least one place and one speaker. So it ties together the relationship between people, stories, and place all into one living archive that is protected by the communities themselves. So what it looks like is you see, of course, the place names here, which are just plotted latitude and longitude. We are working on right now getting the files of David Francis, who's the one who did the pronunciations of the places, and uploading them on here. So when you just go and press it, his voice comes through. But we're working around the file types that are on the CD right now. But then you can also create stories which show up as, they show up on the side here to navigate through. When you click on them, they bring you to the place. So this is a story that took place at Nabiza of a clay, Wabanaki Open Science Camp actually that we did with clay tiles. And it allows you to upload audio or video or imagery of the stories. So we can just take a quick, perfect. Just a quick preview of a short film that we put together.
Clay is beautiful. When you put your hands into it, it just speaks to you, and you can listen to the clay and you can make it become what you want, or you can make it be whatever it tells you it wants to be. Supposedly we all came from clay, and I really feel that.
We are making tiles to go into the.
So it's just, yeah, a preview of how Terra Stories functions with its stories. And again, it's all protected by the access, tribes determining who has access to it. And right now, local context is finding ways to utilize how to get the traditional knowledge labels into Terra Stories, and how we can get these maps into Mukurtu as well. But that is everything that I had today. So I want to say, one, thank you to Wabanaki Youth and Science for inviting me here, and for everyone showing up to listen. I'm happy to answer any questions or yeah, talk about any curiosities that people might have as well.
Maybe about 40 people on the Zoom. Maybe so.
Oh, yeah, I forget that the Zoom is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any questions for Nolan from here, the room? Speak up. I see one mic there. I think they're all around.
I wonder what the collaborative effort looks like now and where you want it to go.
Like with
Like to keep this being built, like
yeah,
to keep this preserved and important
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
the younger generations.
yeah, and again, it's like, yeah, focusing on that how, like who, I know I started recently working with the Waves mentor with documentation projects and having them be out in the field with me doing like documenting oral history in these workshops. So I think looking, much and similar with like Land Back 2, how much of it is relational, and the need for using Wabanaki diplomacy to build relationships and work together. I think putting that in the context of this project, I think, the most obvious thing is working with like Native youth, such as through the WAVES program, to help in this project, to get them understand how Terra Stories works, because a lot of it is also getting to know how to run a server since it's internal. So that's sort of where that intergenerational knowledge comes in, and then it comes with also like working together with non-native organizations. So the work that we did with cultural heritage imaging or with Maine Coast Heritage Trust, who helped get the land returned to us, it sort of speaks to that relational aspect of it. That's, you know, a big crucial need of this project. Yeah.
You made multiple sort of parallels between the intellectual property and land.
Yeah.
And so sort of Mugur is, I mean, it's a web platform, Terra Stories. Can you think about how that might relate to land ownership, use of land? You see parallels there in the technology and the way of approaching it?
Yeah, I think looking at the role that cultural heritage and digital spaces plays in terms of reflecting that more material aspect of it. So I think it's about bringing back a Wabanaki sense of place, and that's where it comes to like sharing this information with non-native partners. So like in this way, it's like protected when we do share this information, but with us sharing our stories and sharing information, it is giving them a different perspective. It's one place where hopefully they're not looking at it as property anymore. You look at our place names and it's all descriptive of the land in its natural state, or from the waterway, because we were canoeing, our ancestors were canoeing to these places a lot. So in that material sense, these when you're interacting with our cultural heritage in these spaces, I do think it changes your perspective on land, not just more as property, and how that over generations will hopefully lead to this creating systems where these things aren't based around ownership. They're based around sort of this collective relation. And again, like that's where the biggest struggle is how do we use this system that works with ownership, which was used for dispossession of indigenous people? How do we use that and to try to dismantle it in a lot of ways? And you can go beyond this regime of ownership and access. Yeah. They're very much, they come together, they're connected. Yeah.
Maybe a comment, maybe there's a question there. It feels like such a different way of relating to your heritage. Yeah. Than traditionally or historically as an oral tradition or in person, a familial community. I mean, the digitizing is where we are, and I love that you have a way of preserving, but it changes that relation to it.
Yeah.
How do you manage that?
Yeah, and that's what I mean, like you ask anybody in the communities, and that's where these frameworks come in to help, because, you know, I don't view myself as owning any part of my culture. Basket makers, you know, they don't view themselves as owning a specific weave or a specific pattern or design. So, but again, how do you protect that? So it's a way of being able to still relate to these things from a relational, not from a regime based on ownership, of a connection of relationality, but still protect them by using the dominant tools that we have to work with, and hopefully get to a time where these aren't the relations that we are working through. But so that just reflects on how much why Indigenous knowledge is important, because we have that relation. We have that relational aspect to land, to our culture, to items. We don't live in a society, or our worldviews, we might materially have to be forced to live in a society based around property. But in terms of like how we actually view these things, it's not. So when these systems, when we are able to reflect our worldviews through our own systems, through our own policies, that's when it will be turned to a more relational aspect rather than ownership. Yeah. That's the thing. That's why we're still here. You know, we don't, we don't view these things as something we own, because that inevitably leads to other people not owning. So it speaks to that tradition of being able to relate to things, relate with things. And using tools for that,
Right, yeah, I mean, it's another tool, right?
Yeah.
It's a very different kind of tool. but-
Yeah.
It's true, it's a good point.
And it strikes me, another observation is just, that it strikes me that that you're using this tool right now, the web. We don't know, I mean, in terms of history and your history especially, that could be gone.
Right, yeah,
And
like,
then what's gonna happen, like the CDs?
that's exactly what I was gonna say, like,
Yeah.
that was literally just early 2000s, and now it's like CDs are like, what is a CD? So that's the conversations we're having with the developers of Terra Stories, is they're really trying to take on that mindset of like, how do we assure that this tool will be relevant and useful for future generations, and how do you build that nest for future generations? Yeah, this is tough though.
I just wanna say too, that I so appreciate you presenting this information, and I feel like what for me was this surface knowledge, the complexity
Yeah.
underneath here, what you present
Yeah.
here, it's just amazing. I'm just barely fathoming it. Yeah,
It's,
I don't have
it's,
words for it
it's
yet.
complex for a reason, like especially any policy or law that revolves around ownership is complex for a reason, because it's protecting that history of dispossession, of ownership.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you consider working with these tools part of land back?
Yeah, I mean, land back is, again, it's not just about this material soil being returned to a community. With land back, it's inevitably connected to culture back, to language back, to ceremony back. And so when you hear, there's actually, I wish I had my water bottle, but I have a sticker that says data back, because how much of, again, this relationship between culture and identity. So when we get our culture back, we're having a resurgence of our identity. And in that, we are creating place. And when we have land returned with that, we have the actual material places to practice ceremony that's coming back, like with Dwayne. So it's very much, it's all connected in getting at that history of dispossession. Again, it wasn't just dispossession of land, it was dispossession of our cultures, of our stories. So it's, yeah, they very much come in hand in hand. Yeah.
To recommend this should be the last time we'll let you go pretty soon, to young people, or any age, but I focus on like Xander's here, one of our keynote managers here at UMM Chimes, how to get involved in this sphere.
Yeah. I know for a fact that we are, and this is the case for a lot of Indigenous communities, so like, we're always, we don't have the capacity compared to much larger non-native organizations, and that's very true for the museum at Motahkomikuk. So I think it again goes back to that relationship building phase of like recognizing what's in place of like Wabanaki Youth in Science and having mentorship opportunities for youth to help out in this work. And that work shouldn't go unpaid for, obviously, like having the resources to pay youth to be able to have this. And that was significant for me. I was a lay student as well when I went through my undergrad and grad, and that changed my whole perspective on education and what I wanted to do with my life, because it allowed me to connect with my culture in this sort of needing to provide for myself as well. So yeah, those connections very much are needed. Yeah.
We'll work on.
Yeah. Sweet.
Okay, let's give a round of applause. Thank you. Yes, okay.
Thank you so much.
Thanks everybody on Zoom, bye-bye.
I don't see it, but-